globalized India is celebrating the joy of books and the energy of new writing. The creative ingenuity of recent generations has broken fresh ground. If Salman Rushdie defined a moment of change by legitimizing the chutneyfication of language, the writers of the last 3 decades have carried these innovations further with remarkable boldness. Since then, even the pace of change has accelerated. Today, Indian English fiction is vibrant with experiments in form and content, with an expanding horizon of subjects that the international links of India are opening up. A complex legacy has been created by Midnight's Children. In this versatile expansion of English, the older hierarchy of languages has lost its meaning. It celebrates the mingling of languages, cultures, and people, the experiences that reflect the literary energy of incredible India. Arundhati Roy's The God of Small Things symbolizes this process and marks the next signpost after Rushdie. In this celebration has emerged the pleasant ritual of book launches, best described as not only the celebration of yet another big novel, but also the rite of passage for a new entrant on the literary landscape. Like other rituals, this too has an unspoken agenda. It is not so much about sales as about visibility. A circle of connoisseurs has become prominent at such events, and they, in some sense, determine the fate of the book through reviews, public opinion, and of course, its admittance at the other new ritual, festivals of literature. The launch may be brilliant, but the lasting reputation of a book depends on another set of significant factors, a secret elixir that most authors hope to find, the elusive mix of good quality writing, contemporary subject, and a gripping story. The novels in English have explored innumerable facets of India because readers on the whole do not show much interest in foreign content. The new generation has successfully culled plot lines from history, biography, and politics to create intricate, even stunning novels that have impacted readership globally.
Speaking from here in London, I think there's been a crisis in British literature, that's the first thing, which meant that there are far fewer good British novels than there has been, for a number of reasons, I think. One is that there are fewer stories to be told. So there's been a vacuum here, I think, in British literature for the past 20 years. And actually into that space has poured the Indian novel. First with Salman, hugely important book. But I think perhaps, funnily enough, the second wave of that was started by Arundhati Roy, her novel God of Small Things. And of course what was important about Arundhati, lots of things are important about Arundhati's book, but one, of course, she lived in Delhi. And Salman by that time was living here. And actually even Midnight's Children, I think, was living here. So I think there are two reasons. One is, and I think Indian literature, first of all, I think it has an extraordinary exuberance of language. That's the first thing. Which British English doesn't have. For lots of reasons. The language of Arundhati or Adiga or Rushdie is more rich, more colourful, more elaborate, more particular perhaps. So it's an invention of a language, one. And the second thing is, I think it's the stories. I think there are stories to be told from India, and the combination of all those factors has meant that the British, so to speak, literary market, if I can put it that way, is remarkably open and has been captured, actually, entirely, seems to me, by the Indian novelists, whether it's those ones or Vikram Seth's another one.
I suspect it's that the rest of the world has become more cosmopolitan in its views. It doesn't see Europe and the richer West, as being necessarily the center of the universe. And so it travels a great deal more than it used to. And perhaps that's the reason, or one of the reasons, why Indian writing has gained more currency in the West. The other, of course, is that though it is true that there were good writers in the past, perhaps there weren't as many as there are now, simply because we don't feel constrained by the medium of the language. Local people are becoming more cosmopolitan, and also because they're seeing Indian writing as being something which has a flavor and an interest of its own, which isn't just trying to ape the West in its style of writing, but uses writing in a more Indian way. Now, of course, the fact that we write in a more Indian way, less self-consciously, let's say, has an effect also on the diaspora. But I'm now talking really not about the diaspora, but upon what you could say the local English-speaking populations. That has weakened the novel in the West. They feel that story is the zone of the airport schlock novel. And I think part of the reason why people want to read books is for the story.
The Indian novel has changed, the Indian novel in English has changed from Rushdie's time, from the time of Midnight's Children until today's time. And I think Midnight's Children and Rushdie, he immediately had a different attitude. His confidence, I think, was crucial to changing the scene of Indian writing in English. I think he really reclaimed the center back for India. This was Indian English, this was our history, this was our politics, and Midnight's Children just showed that bravado. He strode onto the stage and claimed it. Then came a whole lot of new writers. I think he opened the door and a new lot of writers with a lot of confidence. And I definitely see a link to that, and I feel a great debt to his work, you know. Now I see myself, I've seen the world change. The Indian novel in English is awaited and I think respected, looked forward to outside India as well. There are agents interested, publishers interested. India itself has grown more important on the world stage. I don't write solely from India. I write from the Indian diaspora. What is so important to me is not just my own voice or my own story, but multiplicity of voices. The fact, if you're dealing with a multiplicity of voices, many stories, and you're dealing with the diaspora, then you're dealing with a movement. So multiplicity and movement in the form of a novel. So now I think that very form of the novel will have to change to accommodate, a different scene, these different things. And I find that that is very much what my own work is about.
The achievement of Rushdie was in actually convincing British critics, and through them an international audience, to take a novel about India seriously, not just as a novel about India, but as something new in the world of English language literature. In a sense, what Rushdie did was to smuggle into literature both stories and a way of telling them, smuggling in past the sort of immigration inspectors of English literature, a whole new way of experiencing life. And the combination of both the Indian experience that he was recapturing and the way in which he told the story, the use of language, the unfolding of narrative, the evocation of the oral tradition, all of those things, plus, of course, the magic realism that came in as well, all of that suddenly was so dazzlingly new that it made people sit up and look at Indian writing differently. And those of us who followed in his wake, I think, found that because Rushdie had stretched the limits of the possible, as it were, in English language writing about India, he had, in a sense, made the path easier for the rest of us.
I can well remember in 1981 receiving a proof copy of Midnight's Children. Though I do own a first edition of Midnight's Children, I don't own the proofs, which ended up in a wastepaper basket and would have been much more valuable. However, the book made a tremendous impact, and as you know, the one selected as the best Booker Prize of 25 years was Midnight's Children. It's been a massively influential book, and I'm sure that Arundhati Roy and all the other writers who have subsequently been recognised through international prizes, including the Booker, since Rushdie, would not have had the same impact if Rushdie hadn't written that book. But what Rushdie did was to bring back into English fiction that kind of picaresque, rumbustious scale which we had seen in the 18th century, but which had gradually petered out post-Dickens. So I do think he's quite historically important writer. And Rushdie, with that amazing capacity that he's always had to express different tones and levels and nuances of language, to parody and pastiche and to ironize language, really, I think, was a crucial opening up of the possibilities of exploring the diversity of language. So instead of worrying when we came across an Indian word or a concept that we weren't familiar with, we embraced it and accepted it in a way that we would have been reluctant to do perhaps in the decades between the Second World War and the publication of Midnight's Children.
India is one of many places where a lot of interesting books are being written, and I just find this moment in time extremely compelling. Besides, what would be the alternative? I mean, to write about the here and now, I mean, that isn't particularly compelling to me, and this particular moment in time is incredibly interesting and incredibly compelling. It's a growing audience, really. Especially because my books are not easy books. I mean, they're not about sort of normal, the sorts of things that make for popularity, I mean, they're not easy pickup kind of books. But I think in a way that's exactly what brings people to them, people seem to think that, many writers seem to think that the way to write a successful book is by giving people what they want. But who knows what they want? I don't think people know what they want. And I've always believed that, as a writer, you must write, about things that are of interest to you. You must write the kinds of book that you would want to read. And that's always been my credo, really, just to follow my own interests and my own ideas, and to follow them to their logical conclusion. And really, it's very deeply gratifying for me that that these books have found a huge audience around the world. I mean, when I was writing The Glass Palace, for example, I often used to think, who on earth is going to read this book? This book is, the book was about Indian migrants in Burma, starting in the 19th century and so on. I mean, it was such an obscure subject, really. But strangely, the book found a huge audience and a continually growing audience even today. Similarly, with these books, with my last two books, again, they're about fairly obscure sorts of things. And yet again, they seem to have found a wide audience. I mean, my newest book, River of Smoke, is like 530 pages long, and it's about 19th century China. And I think there is a sort of yearning for something more meaningful and something which takes you to some other kind of experience.
I believe personally that there has been a certain form of decline of the French novel since about the Second World War, the end of the Second World War. And the readers who, in fact, had been used to storytelling told prior to the Second World War, and for that matter, during the whole of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, these readers being in fact frustrated by the fact that French writers did not bring them anymore the storytelling. For the past 20 years, they're going towards Asian fiction and specifically Indian fiction. Incredible and imposing tradition of narrative and storytelling, which has been going on for close to 5,000 years in India, and which is slowly coming into the West, and therefore fulfilling the reader's frustration and the reader's need for good storytelling.
So I think it's a bit exaggerated to say 81 and we have a new beginning. Of course, lots of things came up as new topics. The way of writing, in that sense, connected Indian writing with writing outside. So in this sense, one could speak of a turn towards more global concerns as literary concerns, not as political concerns. They came in later with Rushdie's book like Shalimar the Clown, for instance, or Kirina Garka's God's Little Soldier. So I would say that is one of the points where Indian writing moved away from its rather local focus to something more globally oriented without imitating global tendencies. The first name which comes to me is Arundhati Roy. One has the feeling there is a writer who's turned back to India again. But thematically this may be true. Much more focused on India than other writers like Amitav Ghosh or Rushdie. But her concerns, are different from the concerns of her contemporary writers. She is a much more socially committed writer, a very, very committed writer. And in that sense, I think experimenting with language is certainly something new which has come in, sort of picking up on Rushdie, but going much further, I think, and not language by itself. It really ties in with her concerns. To come back to Amitav Ghosh, Amitav Ghosh is a very interesting writer because he has quite a number of different ideas, different topics in his bag. Vikram Seth perhaps is to be mentioned, an equal music which moves away from India, which I as a German reader found totally interesting because part of it takes place in Germany. All those people who moved to Canada, to the United States, to Great Britain, some even to Europe, some even to Germany. There isn't as yet a novel written by an Indian on Germany.
I think maybe it's partly to do with the time that I came into publishing, which was a little before Arundhati Roy's God of Small Things. But possibly to me the division is pre-God of Small Things and post-God of Small Things in terms of the way the world perceived Indian fiction. I would imagine that Salman Rushdie would have been a phenomenon at that time and continues to be, but Midnight's Children was seen as this brilliant, wonderful, unbeatable, but also unrepeatable moment. And so it wasn't so much about Indian writing being a trend, but saying this genius who happens to be Indian and has written this ultimate Indian novel, which possibly nobody else will do again. But Arundhati Roy and God of Small Things said it is done. It has been done by somebody living in India, writing out of India with no great sort of pedigree of connections across the globe. Suddenly having won an award and unanimously, I mean, everybody loved that book. And that seemed to me to make a whole degree of confidence into this country, that it brought a shift of that kind into our writing. And it was also like saying what we are writing for ourselves is possibly the way ahead. Write what you want to write for the Indian reader. And the world, if it's a genuinely done work, and if it means something to the Indian reader, will possibly mean something to the international reader as well.
Things that fiction can do is to bring you, it can bring you the news, but it can also take you into a world that you know nothing about. And one of the great things fiction can do is that. And India, of course, is an extraordinarily large, various country. with an enormous number of different aspects to it, all of which to some degree are fascinating and interesting. And so for British readers, and I guess the same is true for Spanish readers, Italian readers, American readers, there is something sort of wonderful about visiting in fiction a place that you may never actually visit in. For Rushdie and for some of the writers that came after, I think what we all saw was writing of huge confidence, which combined both a great understanding of the classical novel tradition, the 19th century novel tradition. And you can see that in different ways with Vikram Seth, with Suitable Boy. You can see it especially, I think, with Rohinton Mystery, who I think writes brilliant novels. It has a fantastic understanding of that particular tradition, as it were, the kind of Balzac, Dickens tradition. And it's that combined with, I think, the linguistic inventiveness that you get in different ways with Salman, obviously, like explosive literary fireworks, an incredible language, which we see in different ways with Kiran Desai. Vikram, different again, but a wonderful poet, a wonderful maker of puns, a wonderful, loves language, adores it. So, have that combined with great storytelling. Salman opened, he sort of forced an opening.
The real turning point of what's happening is just because of the God of Small Things. I think there's a whole lot of things that are happening at this time, and I mean, surely the God of Small Things is a part of it, But how did I come to write it? Just in the way writers do, I just decided that it was something that I had wanted to do, I think more subconsciously than consciously, for a long time. I'm an architect, and I'd worked in cinema, and I was tired of the teamwork involved in this, and I wanted to do something where it was just between me and the work. I just wanted to do it, it was just between me and the page. And yet, ironically enough, I think that these days the market plays a huge role in what happens with books and intervenes in pretty awful ways now. It's become some kind of corporate activity. When I wrote The God of Small Things, I had no intention of just turning into a novel factory, I mean, I don't think that there's any need to bombard the world with every idea that you have. What I find quite disturbing is that the more noise that is being made on the global stage about Indian English writing, the less relevant that writing, most of that writing is becoming to ordinary people in India. The less connected it is with what's really going on in this country. Hardly any of them seem to have any idea, So it's a very, very disturbing thing when you have a little sort of thin crust of elite writers who are making this global impact but are lifting off the surface of their own country and have very little to do with what's going on here.
For not having loved one's dead father enough, could one make amends by loving one's child more? That idea, an indecisive moth that fluttered out of the blue walls of the police station and circled the head of his mustached interlocutor, took time to form, glass-like, in Jamun's head, much as though it had been biding its time to be recognized, like a scene patiently awaiting a correctly focused lens. I want to report a missing person. With eyes black and deep, of the color and expressiveness of coal, the constable looked at him from far away. The wooden chair creaked like a fart as he shifted forward. After concluding that Jamun looked well-bred enough to deserve a seat, he raised his eyebrows and jerked his chin out in the direction of the aluminium chair before his desk. Jamun subsided onto its edge. He felt exhausted. My father went out very early Tuesday morning and hasn't returned home yet. I thought he was gone. I spent the night at the foot of his bed, but when I awoke, his body had vanished.
The Indian penchant for colour and celebration comes together in a wonderful ground called a festival of literature. In the last few years, Jaipur has gained the reputation for being the largest in Asia, logging 60,000 visitors.
I've always enjoyed reading, and I've never had the opportunity to meet authors. So there was one occasion where I was at an event which was only for authors, and my friend Namita Gokhale was there, and she said, "Don't you think this is a great event where all the authors meet and discuss?" I said, "Listen, this is a great event, but what about people like me? We want to listen to these people. So why can't we have an event where the public watches the authors?" My husband, I must say, he came to the first event and he said, "You know what, this is a great idea and it's going to become very big. I am going to sponsor this event for 10 years. So I think he had the vision to see where it would go.
At home, certainly, literature festivals have proved. If you look at Jaipur Literature Festival, this year they sold 37 lakh rupees worth of books in 5 days, which is roughly what a bookshop in a major city sells in a month. Festivals certainly promote selling of books, primarily also of authors who are unknown, because when somebody comes to the festival and they hear an unknown author read or is in discussion or is interested by what that person says, they immediately say, "Oh, so we must go and buy this person's book," which is quite different from walking into a bookshop, looking at the shelf and choosing the best cover, or reading a review and choosing a best cover. So absolutely it promotes. Internationally, I think two things have happened. One is, of course, English writing out of India. There is a great deal of interest, and that's recorded, over the last decade and a half. Not just because it's been an economically viable proposition for the publishers, because a number of Indian authors have gone on to be very financially successful for publishing houses, but also as many numbers perhaps have not been financially successful. But I think what is coming out of the Indian subcontinent is really new stories, a new take on the world, a new sense of romanticism, a new sense of fiction, a new sense of non-fiction, a new take on contemporary history.
Thiruvanthapuram, Goa, Mumbai, Kolkata are now recognized hubs, and the trend is catching on and reaching remote small towns as well. Literature under such conditions has become a lifestyle statement, different from the earlier notion of literature being an individual experience of reading in solitude. People come to festivals not only to join the bonhomie and buy books, but also to satisfy their urge to engage with writers face to face. Festivals also bring together the publishing industry, editors, literary agents, and the manuscript-carrying authors. Friendships are struck, trade agreements made, and translation rights sold. Experimental genres are fascinating as they emerge. This has also encouraged international publishing houses to set up offices in India, mostly in Delhi. Looking at the possibilities of an enormous book market in India, local talent could hit a sales figure that is mind-boggling. English education and English books evoke a special ambience for the young generation, giving them an assurance of belonging to the economic revolution.
It's been a dream of mine personally and the whole of our board at Hay to come and do a festival and work in India with Indian authors for many, many years. But what brought us here specifically is Shashi Tharoor, of course, is a great author himself, and he's been coming to Hay on Why Festival since about 1992. He suggested if we wanted to come and work in India, we should come and look at Thiruvanthapuram. That's the exciting thing. This is the year dot of many festivals to come in Kerala, and what I want to do over the next years is actually read as much as I possibly can and learn more. Of course, that's what it's all about. It's the celebration and the excitement. I mean, I myself am really, really, really excited about getting this Year Dot Festival off the ground and then learning more and more and more about local writers here. The thought that we can take some of this Indian writing to say, Colombia, to Spain, to Italy, to Germany, to the UK, and expose it, because we find not only it's the writing that's exciting, but it's also the presence of those people, and I think that goes very much into what they write and the passion. You can feel the passion as soon as you meet the authors from here.
I think Indian fiction is in a very exciting phase right now. Apart from the generational family sagas, which used to be the staple of Indian fiction for so many years, we are now having new genres into the mix. We have had our first science fiction fantasy novels. We have had graphic novels, lad-lit, chick-lit, you name it. All kinds of novels are now being written in India. And that is something which can only be of benefit to the readers, the eventual consumers of the novels. I call myself an accidental writer. I wrote my first novel, Q&A, while I was posted at the Indian High Commission in London in 2003. And believe it or not, I wrote it in just 2 months. When I was writing it, I knew that I was onto a good thing. In the sense, I knew that the plot was fresh and the narrative structure was unique. Because I was trying to reveal the private life of my protagonist through the public spectacle of a quiz show. But still, I thought what I had written was a very Indian novel. A novel which did not try to exoticize India. And I thought this would be something which only Indian readers would be able to relate to. So it has come as a pleasant surprise to me that readers in so many different countries have been able to relate to my novel.
Family dynamics are my area of interest because I feel what goes on in a family mirrors what goes on, outside in outside society. So when I write about the family, I am writing about larger issues that govern the behavior that goes on within that family. And so when people say, and that's why when people say they do identify with the position of women, often I'm surprised because I think surely in these kind of situations, say in the Western world, women would be freer than the kinds of lives I depict, but it seems not necessarily so. And so perhaps there is that reassuring sense of that I also feel when I read about situations similar to mine, that these are, and there's an exploring of, a woman's place in her family and in the outside world, that you don't feel so alone, or you don't feel so isolated, or you feel, okay, that this is also happening in other places.
I was almost 40 when I began to, in a sense, write because I found the voice at that particular point of time. It was a very difficult time in my life. I suddenly one day found the voice for my book beating inside my head. I began to write. I wrote without a single bad day for almost a year and a half, 2 years. And the book was done, and that was my first novel, The Alchemy of Desire. And as it turned out, the book was immediately picked up by publishers around the world. It was published in 14 languages. My next book, in that sense, was very, very different from the first one in theme, subject matter, voice, everything. And it's a far more political book. It's a book about India. It's about the underbelly of India. It's about a subject matter that I think needs to be addressed far more seriously by Indian writers than is being done right now. It's about the unequal India. It's about an India that we need to find answers to.
My publishers didn't want me to write literary fiction books. Where they felt a big gap had emerged in the fiction that was emerging from Indian writers writing in English was commercial fiction, and they felt thousands and thousands of predominantly women, to be honest, who are looking for for stories of women friendships or love or marriages and the kind of stuff within the domestic arena. They felt was missing was the kind of book that a woman of Asian origin in Britain would want to read, which is a story about someone like herself who was living in England perhaps, smart, sassy, doing all the things pretty much that you wanted to do, but also facing the kind of dilemmas that women really across the world do. So this was what they wanted. They wanted me to try and come up with stories that fitted into that realm.
Solo was a long book to write. It took me 4 years of writing, and before that I'd been gathering research and things for quite a long time. Bulgaria was a place that had an enormous range of political systems. From it started the 20th century in the Ottoman Empire, and then it became a monarchy and became a fascist state allied with Hitler. Then it was taken over by the Soviets and became a communist state. Then it became a sort of free market capitalist place. And each of these ruptures was very violent, displacing everything that had gone before. And I wondered what it would be like for somebody to live through all of those periods and how they would get to the end of their life and think back on their life with any sense of coherence. And a very intense book, because it was a book which took me into the interiority of a very old man who's blind, who's shut up in a house and doesn't really ever leave, and all his thoughts. And it was he became a very close presence for me, visiting me in my dreams and living alongside me for quite a long time.
I think it's because somewhere India is a microcosm of the world. The world is changing so fast, and India within itself contains several of the last centuries, and it is also a window into the future. So it's almost as though all the stories are compressed into here. It's like 1,001 tales. There's an urgency about it, which readers in the publishing industry can hear, because a novel is a social form. Its job is to look at society, to question society, and the individual within that society. And I think another very important part of this is that Indian literature is carrying so many different traditions in it. We had a evolved aesthetic in the Natya Shastra, and each of the 22 languages, or very many of the 22 languages which are in the scheduled languages in India, have their own particular literary history, their own style of literary tradition, and this is carried forward even into Indian English writing.
My novel, The Bus Stopped, which gave the reader a narrative of a bus journey. And just as people get on a bus and then get off, united for the duration of the journey by the journey, the stories got onto that novel and got off, united by something that took place during the journey. In my other novel, Filming a Love Story, I examine the stories of partition, independence of India, and the early years of Indian cinema. In this novel, perhaps I've moved closer to more Western concerns with multiculturalism, because this takes place largely in London. But this is London in the 1830s, the thing about thugs.
Amir and Jenny, the woman he is in love with, and who is in love with him, go out for a walk in Victorian London, early Victorian London. Jenny and Amir could not hold hands in the polite parts of the city. Having spent the afternoon at Hyde Park, watching squirrels quarrel with long-tailed tits in the uneasy company of people of the higher classes, they were now walking back to Amir's half-house. Amir relished these rare trips, for Jenny was always working, to parks or monuments. He was fascinated by the look of rapture with which Jenny pointed out the latest features of the place they visited. This time, it was the monumental entrance at Hyde Park Corner, which Jenny recalled being built when she was a child. But while she could point out all the new features, she was largely ignorant of the history of the parks and palaces. She would listen with a combination of disbelief and fascination when Amir supplied some of the missing history, culled from papers or gossip.
written 2 novels and 2 non-fiction books, and I think the novels were really the ones in which one could explore different aspects of India, both modern India and historical India, and the feedback that I have got shows that it's not that we are not writing in a dark room. We are writing in a room where every window is open and the words are flying out, and you get feedback in a globalized world from corners you'd never expect. The world's readers are today looking at India as a literary powerhouse. And this is only when we are talking of Indian writing in English. The Indian writing in other language is still relatively unexplored. And I wonder what will happen when all that comes out into English through translation and you have a really big explosion.
Bearing in mind the growing interest in books and the purchasing power of the new generation, these festivals have as much to do with marketing as with literature. The bookstalls do brisk business, some of them notching up sales in a few days that may be the equivalent of a month's business. What are people reading? In the urban centers, English books reach out to cosmopolitan buyers. But in the regional capitals, the emphasis is equally on local language books, which generally have much higher sales. In Kolkata, often called the paradise for book lovers, people throng stalls in huge numbers. Surprisingly, they read in a bilingual manner, often going for the English translation of a popular local title. Though buying in the local market, the readers experience an outreach to global avenues. Indian writing in English is best known for its fiction. This can be attributed to the enormous diversity of material in the culture of India and the modern writer's fascination with the emergence of new realities. After Salman Rushdie's moment and Arundhati Roy's insistence on a culturally located history, aspiring writers are constantly mapping the new India opening before their eyes. This is symptomatic of India's multifaceted growth and reflects the confidence of a globalized nation. The stories are attractive and contemporary. Young people encountering urbanity, redefining love, retelling history, crime, violence, and complex human sentiments.
I think we are going through an important phase right now. And what's happening now is that Indian writing in English, as it's called, is not the preserve of the affluent writers anymore. And increasingly, as the middle class begins to write, the most fascinating consequence is that a lot of writers, though they may not articulate it this way, they are looking at themselves as regional writers who happen to write in English. And that is making the English literature that's coming out of India more authentic. And there are all kinds of influences. The influence of regional cinema. I'm as much influenced by Tamil cinema as I am by other forms of literature, actually. And I see this happening all around me. And I think that's very interesting. There's something honest about it. And there's something very personal about this kind of literature. And what is happening is as Delhi slowly loses its hold on Indian literature, we find people who are less obsessed with the national canvas, the large canvas, and questions of sociological importance. People are interestingly getting more personal. They're writing about their own families. They're writing about emotion. They're writing about small towns. So all this is happening, and I find that very interesting, actually.
What's happened is that I think we have found our confidence in our language, and what's happening is this kind of explosion with literature. And I feel in a way that we have taken that language of English and made it our own. And, you know, I'm certainly interested in sort of that chutneyfication that Rushdie was sort of the one to spearhead, and the idea that you can take that language and put your own stories in there. So I feel it's a very exciting time for literature coming out of India. The Pleasure Seekers was a story that I've been wanting to write for a long time. I had the idea in my head for a few years before I actually started writing. And there wasn't, a specific synopsis or plan, but I knew that I wanted to write a love story. And I wanted to take the details from my own life, this Welsh Gujarati angle, which I thought was quite fascinating and different. And I wanted Madras to be at the center of it, because I feel like Madras is neglected in terms of cities in the Indian English literary scene.
What has happened is there is this massive churning happening, and there are people writing from places which are not necessarily the urban, elite, cosmopolitan, English-speaking pockets of India. There are people writing from Kashmir, for instance, from the northeast, and there are people writing from South India, and who are not necessarily writing for a market in the UK. They are being published in India and they are finding a market. And of late, a more interesting thing has happened. There are people writing about very new things that have happened in India. While I was in Delhi University, I knew I wanted to write a novel, and novel set in Kashmir, talking about my childhood and teenage and the brutal 90s in Kashmir. But I just couldn't get it right. So I carried these stories with me to London, and sort of they sat on my computer somewhere. And then, but I knew I had to write this big story about Kashmir and growing up in the valley. Until late 2006, when I sort of an old premise sort of came back to me, which related to a real incident in Srinagar. And I remember this night when I just got up and started writing about it, but not about the incident I was talking about, but sort of setting it in the mountains of Kashmir, where the army and the militants are sort of engaged in fighting and battles and encounters, and the army is cracking down on people crossing over from Pakistan administered Kashmir, or indeed going into Pakistan administered Kashmir from Kashmir.
I'd like to think that it's primarily because of the remarkable improvement in the quality as well as the content of Indian writing. As Indians, we have so many stories to tell. We have families with a whole lot of turmoil going on inside them. We also have so many states with their own peculiarities and their own little nuances and details, which are today appealing so much to the Western audience. From the homespun writing style of the early Indian authors writing in English, we then moved on to the stylists, the Salman Rushdie and Vikram Seth, who wrote as if English was their native language. And I think that is what has created and generated the huge amount of interest in Indian writing to start with. And that's the platform on which we Indian authors have been consistently building in the last couple of years. I think coupled with the fact that the tremendous growth in the Indian economy has put India on the publishing map, as well as the fact that the entry of foreign publishers into India, like HarperCollins and Hachette in the last 5 years, all this has just added up beautifully to make us a more confident lot of Indian authors. And today we are tackling a whole lot of themes, from the life in the underbelly of the cities to finding a suitable boy to marry.
I certainly do believe that Salman Rushdie's talent and Midnight's Children's startling difference from what had gone before began to make Indian literature what it is in the world today. The interest was generated obviously by the Booker Prize, but by the writing itself, by the adoption of magic realism, if you like, the methods of Günter Grass and slightly of James Joyce into the integrity of Indian literature, which had till then, if you want to ask the reason why Indian literature in English became suddenly famous. In India, you get two things. One, you get an extremely complex society which nobody understands and needs deciphering. 2 or 3 things. 2, you get a kind of false spirituality. So people are looking for that too. And the third thing you get is, apart from the complexity of Indian life and Indian society and the layers of it, you get an extremely secure family structure which needs to be explored for all its complexities, hypocrisies, deceptions, traditions, restrictions, and so on. So right through, you get that family business playing through Midnight's Children, through Vikram Seth's A Suitable Boy, and into 100 novels that I can name, with Amitav Ghosh, and novels which really concentrate on the family that they know. They don't know India beyond the family, not enough to write about. So you get sketchy political novels, but basically you get a novel which concentrates on the hidden affairs, ordinary dynasties. And that's what that was different from what Britain had, and Britain began to read it.
The success of new generations clearly indicates the writing on the literary map. Yet, newer forms of expression are being explored, experimented with, adopting fresher narrative techniques. The onward global march of the Indian English novel is unabated.